There is a small town, nestled in the shadow of an old forest, isolated from the outside world by miles of rugged hills and winding roads. The locals in this town had a tradition that had lasted for generations. Every year, at midnight on Halloween, they would hold a special mass at the town's ancient, crumbling church. The church itself was a relic of the past, standing in eerie solitude at the edge of the forest. It was said to be built on cursed land, a place where the living were never supposed to tread. As the story goes, many years ago, a group of townsfolk had tried to abandon their faith, turning away from the church and towards something far darker. They had held their own midnight gatherings in the forest, performing unspeakable rituals, calling on forces that should never have been summoned. It's said that the land around the church had become tainted ever since, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, where dark things waited to cross over. The midnight mass was meant to keep those forces at bay, to appease the restless spirits and keep the darkness from spreading. Most of the town's residents attended out of fear more than faith. It was a solemn, haunting ritual. No one spoke. No one dared to look outside the windows of the old church. They knew better. They had heard the stories. For years, the mass went on without incident. But one Halloween night, not long ago, something went terribly wrong. That year, a young woman named Emily had returned to town after being away at college. She was skeptical of the old traditions, dismissing the midnight mass as mere superstition. She hadn't been back in town long, but the isolation and strange atmosphere unsettled her. Her family insisted she attend the mass, just like everyone else. "It's important," her mother had said, her eyes clouded with fear. "You can't miss it." Reluctantly, Emily agreed, though she secretly planned to leave early, thinking it was all a waste of time. When they arrived at the church, Emily was struck by how desolate it looked. The stone walls overgrown with moss, the stained glass windows cracked and dirty. Inside, it was dimly lit by flickering candles, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wax and damp wood. As the mass began, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She glanced at the darkened windows, and for just a moment, she thought she saw a shadow pass by outside. Her heart raced, but she told herself it was nothing. The priest's low voice echoed through the church, but Emily couldn't focus on the words. Her mind was elsewhere, fixated on that fleeting shadow. Halfway through the mass, the old wooden doors of the church creaked open, sending a chill through the congregation. Everyone turned to look, but there was no one there. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the candles flickered violently as if they might go out. The priest's voice faltered for a moment before he continued, more hurried this time, as if he too was trying to finish the ritual before something terrible happened. Emily's unease grew. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and when she turned to look, there was nothing but darkness behind her. Her skin crawled. Suddenly there was a loud bang from the back of the church, as if something had slammed against the door. The priest froze, his eyes wide with fear. The congregation sat in stunned silence. Another bang, louder this time. Then a whisper, faint but clear, swept through the church like the sound of many voices speaking at once, though no one could make out the words. Emily's blood ran cold. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something was about to break through the thin walls of reality that separated them from the other side. The priest frantically began to pray, louder and louder, his voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. The doors of the church burst open with a deafening crash, and a cold, Unnatural wind swept inside, extinguishing the candles. Darkness engulfed the room. In the pitch black, Emily heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They seemed to come from everywhere at once. People began to scream, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness. Something was inside the church with them. Emily stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to move toward the door, but the air around her felt thick, as if something was pressing down on her. She could hear whispers all around her, the same voices she had heard before. Only now they were louder, clearer. "Join us." The words sent a wave of terror through her. She ran blindly toward the exit, her hands outstretched in the dark, but something grabbed her wrist, cold, bony fingers that felt like they belonged to the dead. She screamed and pulled away with all her strength, her body trembling with fear. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but the darkness remained. She burst through the doors, gasping for air, and collapsed on the cold ground. Behind her, the church stood in silence, its doors wide open, as if nothing had happened. The congregation slowly filed out, pale and shaken, but no one spoke of what they had seen. They never did. To this day, the midnight mass continues, and the townspeople still gather at the old church every Halloween. They say that those who don't attend, who try to leave, are never seen again. Emily, though she escaped that night, never spoke of what happened, but she knew that something dark had followed her home. It was always there, just on the edge of her vision, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next midnight. Because once you see them, they never let you go. In the days following the midnight mass, Emily tried to shake off the horror of what had happened. She told herself that her mind had played tricks on her in the dark, that the fear of the mass had stirred her imagination. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just fear. There was something more, something real. The night after the mass, Emily barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, those shadowy figures moving in the darkness of the church, their whispers filling her ears. She would wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst from her chest. Her mother noticed her growing anxiety. "You look pale, Emily. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine. She felt like she was being watched constantly, especially at night. Her room felt oppressive, the air thick with an unshakable dread. Every time she turned off the lights, the darkness seemed to press in closer, like it was alive. One night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The room was still, but she had the strangest feeling that she wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner of the room. At first, she saw nothing but shadow. Then, her breath caught in her throat. In the dim light from the moon, she could just make out a figure standing in the corner. It was tall and thin, with long, twisted limbs. Its face was hidden in the dark, but she could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. For a moment, Emily was paralyzed with fear. Her body refused to move, her mind screaming at her to run, to do something, but she couldn't. She lay frozen in her bed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the thing could hear it. Slowly, it began to move toward her, its footsteps soft but deliberate, the sound barely a whisper on the hardwood floor. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, praying it was a dream, a hallucination. But when she opened them again, it was closer, much closer. She could see its face now, a hollow, pale mask of emptiness, with eyes that seemed to sink into the dark pits of its skull. Its mouth was open slightly, as if it was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Terror washed over her and she finally found the strength to move. With a scream, she jumped out of bed and flicked on the light. The room flooded with brightness, and just like that, the figure was gone. She stood there trembling, her heart still racing, her body covered in cold sweat. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched remained. Emily couldn't stay in her room after that. She spent the rest of the night on the couch downstairs, the lights on in every room. But even then, the house didn't feel safe. She knew it wasn't over. Whatever had been in the church that night, whatever had followed her, wasn't going to stop. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and dread. She avoided the church and tried not to think about the midnight mass. She convinced herself that it was her mind playing tricks on her, that the terror of that night had left her paranoid. But deep down, she knew better. On the third night, things escalated. Emily was home alone. Her parents had gone out for the evening, and she had planned to spend the night catching up on some schoolwork. She sat in the living room, the TV on in the background, trying to distract herself from the growing sense of unease that had been following her since the Mass. As she worked, she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps above her. She froze. The house was old, and it often creaked, but this was different. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking from room to room. Her blood ran cold. She was supposed to be alone. For a moment, she thought about calling her parents, but she didn't want to scare them or seem paranoid. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly made her way upstairs, her heart pounding in her ears. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped. The hallway stretched out in front of her, dark and silent. She stood there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Then she heard it again. Footsteps, this time coming from her bedroom. Fear gripped her, but she forced herself to move. She stepped into the hallway, her hand trembling as she held the flashlight in front of her. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. Slowly, she made her way toward her room. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, her breath catching in her throat as the door creaked. The room was empty, just as she had left it. But the feeling was still there, that oppressive, heavy presence. Then she saw it, on the floor. In the center of the room was a single black feather. It looked out of place, unnatural. She bent down to pick it up, her fingers shaking. The moment her hand touched the feather, a cold, sharp pain shot through her body. She dropped it, stumbling back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly the room went cold, freezing cold. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the lights began to flicker. The whispering voices returned, louder this time, surrounding her, filling her head. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, malice. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Emily screamed and ran toward it, but it wouldn't budge. The voices grew louder, more frantic, as if they were right behind her, closing in. She could feel something in the room with her, something dark and ancient. She banged on the door, screaming for help, but no one was there to hear her. The lights flickered again, and then, in the brief moments of darkness between flickers, she saw it, the figure from her nightmare, standing in the corner of the room, its hollow eyes fixed on her. "Join us." The voices whispered in unison, echoing in her mind. Emily fell to her knees, her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The voices were inside her head now, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, praying for it to stop. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room went silent. Emily opened her eyes. The figure was gone, the lights steady once more. She stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking, and ran from the room, not daring to look back. She didn't stop running until she was out of the house, standing in the cold night air, gasping for breath. She knew then that she could never go back. Whatever had followed her home, whatever had marked her that night at the midnight mass, wasn't going to leave her. It was just waiting for the right moment to take her. And next time, she wasn't sure she'd be able to escape.